Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm Mariam Golnaraghi, Director of Climate Change and Environment at the Geneva Association, and I'm tuning in from Zurich. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Geneva Association 2025 Climate Change and Environment Conference titled Resilience to Extreme Weather, the Power of Prevention and Innovation. We are delighted to have nearly 1,200 registrants representing insurance, finance, government, academia, risk modeling, technology, engineering, industry, international organizations, and the media today. Thank you for taking the time to join us. First, let me start with 3 housekeeping points. To submit your questions, please click the Q&A icon and type in your questions for the panelists. Now, to get translated captions, click Show Captions, enable translation, and select your preferred language. The conference is being recorded. Recordings and slides will be shared with you by tomorrow, and the conference summary will be available on the conference website very soon. Now, the Geneva Association is committed to adhering strictly to the principles of national and international antitrust laws, which will be followed here. Now, this conference comes at a time of great uncertainty. Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica a few hours ago as a Category 5 hurricane. It has made landfall in Cuba as a Category 3 hurricane and is expected to make landfall in Dominican Republic and Haiti. Now, when it comes to extreme weather and slow changing climatic events, this year also has witnessed many catastrophic events, such as the tragic Los Angeles wildfires, Canada's second worst wildfire season, European heat waves and droughts causing major socioeconomic disruptions with rippling effects, destructive monsoon floods in Asia, and severe droughts in Africa and Asia, just to name a few. Now, as global progress on energy transition and decarbonization is lagging behind targets, scaling up investments in resilience of residential, commercial, industrial assets, critical infrastructure, and urban system is more vital than ever to ensure public safety, socioeconomic stability, and national security. This conference builds on Geneva Association's research focused on developing risk management solutions to enable and expedite transitioning to a more climate resilient and low carbon economy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, global insured losses from weather-related extreme events have risen 5-fold over the past 3 decades, from less than 20 billion USD per annum to over 100 billion USD per annum. Now, in this figure, you will see that insured losses from large-scale, high-impact perils such as hurricanes are shown in dark blue. Light blue is insured losses from high-frequency localized perils such as floods, wildfires, and convective storms, and the remaining uninsured direct losses are shown in red. Let me highlight 3 key points. Globally, economic losses are roughly 3 times of insured losses, pointing to a wide protection gap, which is further growing. Insured losses have been above 100 billion USD every year since 2020, and 55% of insured losses are now from localized and more frequent hazards, such as floods and wildfires. Now, as you know, access to insurance is critical for economic growth, backing investments, and building financial resilience. Yet, without insurance, the financial burden of natural catastrophes falls on individuals, businesses, and the governments. Now, rising physical climate risk already have been leading to rising insurance availability and affordability challenges in some regions for some perils. But this is not just caused from climate change. In fact, many socioeconomic factors are driving assets and exposures and vulnerability of assets to extreme weather. For example, land zoning practices, where we build, using old building codes, that's how we build, Aging infrastructure and utilities operations, in fact, these are leading to higher impacts. For example, many wildfires around the world are set by faulty power lines, or urban flash floods are further exacerbated because of unmaintained water and sewage system or their low capacity. Now, urban design and development is another factor, for example, densification and destruction of nature-based systems. And last but not least, higher cost of rebuilding, from inflation to supply chain disruptions, labor shortages. Now, decisions made by a complex landscape of stakeholders impact assets' exposure and vulnerability throughout their life cycle. For example, decisions that we are making as owners of homes, industrial, commercial assets, infrastructure systems, and utilities. Decisions by authorities responsible for land zoning, permitting, and building codes. Development and construction industry, real estate markets, mortgage and lending sector, and institutional investors, and authorities that are responsible for crisis management and disaster prevention. Insurers are actually at the receiving end of these risks. And in fact, insurance industry has been promoting the need for risk-based insurance pricing to bring focus to where risks must be reduced or prevented, and where investments are needed for initiatives to build resilience to keep insurance affordable. Now, understanding trends in exposure and vulnerability is key to targeting high impact resilience investments. Addressing these trends requires identifying and scaling proven preventive measures and innovative risk management approaches through a system-wide multi-stakeholder effort with all hands on deck. And this is the focus of this conference, the power of prevention and innovation. Now, to frame our research, we have focused on how to prioritize and who needs to be doing what to first reduce existing risk by investing in retrofitting of existing assets and infrastructure systems. And second, how do we prevent new risk with two opportunities? After a disaster, through strategic retrieves from high-risk areas and rezoning, or rebuilding forward more resiliently. And then for any new construction, whether it's home, industrial, commercial, or infrastructure system, doing risk-based zoning and using updated building codes. Now, we found many examples around the world, from Australia to Japan to Europe to UK, US, Canada, where scalable initiatives are already making impact at local and asset level with incentives. And they are actually driving transformative resilience enhancements at those scales. These are implemented through collaboration across layers of government, with different private sector stakeholders, and even by communities and homeowners. For example, strategic policies and legislations in Japan to avoid building in high-risk zones, aligning hazards and impacts across layers of the government with insurance industry, and focusing government investment on resilient infrastructure in Australia, certification programs with financial incentives for homeowners that are being implemented in US and Australia, engaging local state governments, builders, insurers, mortgage lenders. And finally, in our research, we demonstrate that we can do a lot more by enabling reformed changes in our project finance processes, in our mortgage and lending processes, real estate valuation, to incorporate climate risk as part of the decisions looking ahead. Now, with the rising entrepreneurial spirit around the world, we also see numerous innovative solutions in a wide range of areas that we have shown here. And these are to enhance risk modeling, to develop measures for risk reduction and risk prevention in different sectors, and significant innovation in the way insurance industry delivers its business. Now, moving to the agenda, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers who are among global leaders and champions on prevention and innovation. We start with Andreas Berger, Group CEO of Swiss Re, who will deliver the keynote. We then move to first panel, titled From Recovery to Prevention, Building Resilience Before the Storm. Then after a 5-minute break, we move to our second panel on innovation and prevention at the crossroads of wildfire management. And then we close with closing remarks from my colleague, Jad Aris, Managing Director of the GA. Now, with no further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Andreas Berger, Group CEO of Swiss Re. His keynote is titled Beyond the Payout, the Power of Prevention and Innovation Amidst Extreme Weather Events. Thank you, Andreas, for taking the time from your very busy schedule to join us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Mariam, thank you very much. And it was very insightful what you just said. So I'm running the risk not to repeat a few facts that you're already mentioning, but I was told repetition, repetition, repetition. It always helps because only then things sink in. So thank you for the invitation. And I saw on the list of participants a few names that are familiar to me. So hello to all the friends here that I know from previous engagements or current engagements. So Benjamin Franklin, who helped found one of America's first fire insurers, he captured this core idea by saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So just let that sink in, because our challenge is to turn this maxim into mainstream practice, shift from pure risk transfer in the traditional form that we know of to real risk transformation, true risk transformation. And here I can really say that prevention works. Prevention works, as we have on the ground examples of this in action, for instance, with the Hurricane Katrina and Ida. 2025 marks the 20th anniversary since Katrina struck, and it proved to be a watershed. So we had 1,392 lives lost and roughly $225 billion in today's money in economic losses. At US dollars 105 billion in insured losses, it was actually one of the costliest single loss, insured loss on record. And to protect New Orleans from future storms, the US responded with prevention measures. $14.6 billion invested in levees, gates, pumps, and also flood walls. And this came alongside, as you said before, tighter land use and also tighter building codes. So when Hurricane Ida struck in 2021, the new defenses passed their first real test and preventing basically also widespread flooding. The lesson here is absolutely clear. Targeted prevention dramatically reduces lives lost and damages to properties and infrastructure. So natural catastrophe losses continue to trend higher by 5 to 7% annually in real terms. And you showed that graph also from the Swiss Re Institute. In 2024, global economic losses from natural catastrophes are estimated to have been around $318 billion. Insured losses made up $137 billion, leaving a natural catastrophe protection gap of 57% or $181 billion. These are not just abstract figures. They represent impacted households, businesses, public finances, or buildings, schools, etc. And such natural catastrophe strike. Narrowing the protection gap is absolute paramount, and it requires doing two things at once. Risk reduction through smarter use of land, as you said, stronger building codes, resilient infrastructure, but also at the same time, more effective risk transfer. The coverage needs to be appropriate. We need to bring innovative products in, public-private partnership solutions, if necessary or needed. And you have mentioned a few countries where there are very prominent examples where these PPP solutions worked. But the goal is simple: help more people and places impacted by extreme weather events rebound faster after an event, This is what we usually mean by social or societal resilience. Reinsurers are society's financial shock absorber. That's what we always say. In a warming world, risk transfer alone cannot really keep the pace. We can surely support beyond risk transfer through pricing signals, underwriting standards, data and partnerships, which can support loss prevention. This is very relevant, in particular in our interlinked world. Local hazards can have significant effects on people and the economy at a regional but also national level. For example, in 2018, low water on the Rhine, the River Rhine, cut barge payloads to 40% of normal. Nuclear plants curtailed output through not having enough cooling water. And German industrial production actually fell by around 1.5%, and GDP by 0.4%. Interlinked supply chains can affect factory production elsewhere too. In summer 2024, an aluminium factory flooded in the Swiss Rhone Valley, disrupting deliveries to the German automotive industry. These examples illustrate how we must build resilience for the network, not just the node, treating infrastructure, supply chains, communications, and energy security as a connected system. Now, what's working? Innovation that turns insight into impact, such as parametric covers. We've been talking about this a lot, and we had it on one of your slides. Parametric covers that enable fast access to liquidity and also incentivize risk reduction. Insurance-linked securities mobilize capital from financial markets, this at scale, or natural catastrophe protection. Data-driven services help clients, and they help clients see and manage risk before losses occur. A concrete example we developed with our, what we call RDS, the Risk Data Services Platform, that we developed at Swiss Re. Decision makers can now get asset level exposure views, property, supply chains, sustainability, linked to extreme weather perils. Digital twins are being built, and they enable scenario tests that guide investments and also maintenance. A strong partner ecosystem, including high quality flood intelligence, which we can now provide also through the acquisition of Fathom, a very university-backed company from Bristol. And this strengthens insights and puts them in hands of those who build and operate critical assets. And this with data being organized in a very effective way with state-of-the-art technology. What else is working? Policy, pricing, standards, and align incentives with outcomes. We know that price signals can reward also prevention. From our perspective, risk-based pricing supports risk reduction measures and discourages building in harm's way. Standards and codes to build resilience, that's what you also mentioned before. It's like in the US, adopting modern building codes is estimated to yield $6 to $12 in benefits per $1 invested, according to US National Institute of Building Sciences. So $1 prevention saves you $6 to $12 afterwards in repair costs. And however, less than 35% of Americans live in communities that have adopted building codes. 35%. Clearly, this leaves a gap that can hurt vulnerable communities' resilience. And here's another way of looking at it. Swiss Re Institute estimated insured losses from Hurricane Ian in 2022 to be between 50 to 65 billion US dollars. In fact, Ian was actually the second costliest hurricane on record after Hurricane Katrina. The good news is homes built to Florida's stronger building codes adopted in 2022 saw significantly reduced damage compared to older construction. That's very good news. Now, the paradox, while loss reductions from improved building codes were significant, the region's massive population increases in recent years and increased asset values in harm's way outweigh the preventions gained. That's really the big elephant in the room, the concentration of assets, also mainly due to population growth. The takeaway is this: loss prevention includes stronger building standards, but it shouldn't stop there. It should be accompanied by integrated urban planning and land use rules designed to avoid high-risk areas and support long-term insurability. Also for infrastructure planning and project design, considering risk insights early, that supports obviously lower risk levels and helping attract capital. Public-private partnerships that preserve signals, they can be quite effective. Now, the public-private partnerships and parametric covers can expand insurance affordability and speed up payouts without impairing the integrity of the risk signal. And the affordability topic is obviously more center of all discussions than ever before. But the design matters for their success. And there's no one-size-fits-all, especially in mature markets, where more developed insurance industries, public-private partnerships need to complement existing mechanisms without replacing them. That's can very often be seen as a top-up. Now, there's an example in the city of Fremont in California with community flood coverage. So we have worked as Swiss Re with partners to provide parametric flood cover to the city of Fremont in California. Around 230,000 people, people's homes. This is the first city in the US to buy its own citywide flood insurance policy. When flood parameters are met, the program will deliver immediate payouts that can be used to clean up debris, help uninsured citizens, or mitigate disaster-stretched municipal budgets. Now, UK Flood Relief Program is another very often quoted example where government and insurers work together to make flood insurance more affordable. And this is another example of public and private partners working effectively together. As part of this program, homeowners affected by high water can get financial support to invest in flood-resilient adaptation, so they are less vulnerable to the next storm. And while the partners in the UK note that there's more to be done, a report out this month recommends extending the program to include considerations for small to medium enterprises and not just private households. Research by our Swiss Re Institute shows that in general, the economic benefits of flood adaptation measures can be up to 10 times the cost of post-disaster rebuilding, a figure that is similar to the one that I mentioned just before. And it makes sense to invest where prevention has outsized payouts. Staying with floods for a moment, flood retention areas could reduce the expected annual river flood damage in Europe by around 75%, strengthening existing dikes can cut river flood damages by 60%. These are precisely the measures that move risks back into the insurable and also then affordable zones. It is a multi-stakeholder effort and approach to increase climate resilience. We've got governments and municipalities, and to implement hand-in-hand risk-based spatial zoning and building code enforcements, resilient infrastructure and early warning systems. Entrepreneurs and builders innovate resilient materials for hail, wind, wildfires, and flood. And There are new hurricane-resistant communities being built in Florida, for instance. And you can see definitely the impact when you see hurricanes with landfall, where the damages happen and where not. Homeowners and communities retrofit and modernize to today's standards and adopt best practices, for example, by removing combustible material around homes in wildfire zones. A lot's being discussed around that in California at the beginning of the year. And then technology and AI. Technology and AI support professionals with real-time wildfire detection, rainfall monitoring, proactive water level management, and the like. Public policy is another one that reduces underlying risk and can support narrowing also the protection gap. So we all support these measures, and they rebalance basically the ex post recovery to the ex ante prevention. Now, a commitment from our side, we say we're committed to help clients and public partners measure, price, and reduce risks. Also with the RDS digital twin platform, yes, that's a more modern approach, but also up to parametric public-private partnerships like the flood insurance program in Fremont, California. As losses trend higher, effective prevention and adaptation measures are absolutely essential to maintain insurability and hopefully then also affordability. Now with this, I say thank you, and I wish you also a great program here.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Pleasure. What a rich statement with so many examples, giving us a number of ideas which we will explore further in the panels. I still have 3 minutes, and I want to use those 3 minutes to ask you some questions. We have actually collected questions from the audience as they registered for the conference. We might have time for one, possibly two. So the first question is, which key weather-related perils, based on your extensive research, you see being influenced by climate change signal today? Any insight on that?
Yeah, it's a mixed picture, and we're still learning. That's very clear. But Swiss Re Institute has shown that some perils you can more likely, relate to climate change, and some there's still early days. Very clearly, climate change signals include the droughts, heat waves, wildfires. I mean, we've seen this. There's a stronger attribution there. But then there are also other perils where there's no clear pattern and clear picture that we can see at this stage. So what we do is we have every event in the world is a new data point that we enter into our models and adjust them continuously. I think we've got one of the most complete models that you can find in the world, because the ones that you usually get historically, they sometimes focus on certain perils only or on certain regions. I can, for instance, say that floods have been modeled probably 6 years ago, we started. And that was just in its infancies. Now we got so much better and it's more sophisticated. So it is a journey that we're on. And that's why the data that we get are much more granular and more precise in today's world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And you touched on AI. And obviously, there is good and there is not so good, particularly when it comes to energy use and water use. But there is a lot of good in use of AI. In your opinion, how do you see different stakeholders, from businesses to governments, communities, leverage this technology in their adaptation and resilience measures? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, AI is the big buzzword. AI for us is not really new. We've been dealing with AI in the broader sense for more than 15 years or so. Machine learning, we've been dealing with this for such a long time, advanced analytics and so on. What we look at the moment, it's more Gen AI, generative AI, but in particular also agentic AI. When we deal with data in our universe, structured and unstructured data, I feel so much more comfortable. But then as we access data from outside, we gotta be careful, and we gotta set up a proper governance around the usage of data and AI, because we always call it responsible usage of AI, and have a constant human in the loop and taking ultimately the decision. Why am I saying that? Because data per se already can be a problem. Data per se can be biased. Algorithms can be biased, which, by the way, will be new emerging risks, that we will have to deal with on our liability side of the balance sheet. But you can use AI also for predictive policy planning. On our database, for instance, when you just look at creating a digital twin of, let's say, physical assets of a given municipality, and then you can stress test this digital twin with the events, and then can see how does your asset structure behave, and you can then build scenarios, projections into the future, seawater level rises or temperature rises, and see what impact does this have on your asset structure, and give you informed insights to address prevention, mitigation, also CapEx decisions, or even for governments, predictive policy planning, disaster response optimization. And as we speak, we are working on an initiative also with the US government exactly on this specific topic of first response, optimization of first response. But we said this is one part of the equation. The other one is actually the prevention. And we should not forget the prevention element. For businesses, I mean, AI can be used for supply chain resilience, to make your supply chains transparent, and also, again, see how do supply chains behave in certain scenarios. Business continuity planning. Homeowners, I mean, can also use this. We do this for banks also, where we take their mortgage portfolio and create that digital twin of their mortgage portfolio and see how does this existing exposure behave in certain circumstances, whether extreme weather events and so on. Has that been priced in and so on? These are the critical questions that can all be supported by the stronger use of AI.
Thank you so much. I have so many more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I really would like to thank you for taking the time. And we wish you a wonderful afternoon and looking forward to a lot of future collaboration. Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you.
Thank you, and have fun in the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we move to our first panel, from recovery to prevention, building resilience before the storm. And I'm very pleased to introduce Rakhi Kumar, Senior Vice President of Sustainability Solution and Business Integration at Liberty Mutual Insurance, who will moderate this session. I will jump in 35 minutes into this discussion, and I will moderate the discussion with the audience. In the meantime, thank you, Rakhi, for your commitment and engagement for design of this panel. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience. Welcome to our panel, and we're very excited to be here. In her opening remarks, Mariam did articulate the issues we would be touching upon today, from reducing existing risk to preventing new ones, to enabling new policies and incentivizing behavior change. But it's important to define what we mean by prevention. And for this panel, at least, let's say prevention is incorporating climate resiliency in the planning, design, permitting, construction, and investment in various sectors, be it housing, energy, etc., for the infrastructure systems and for infrastructure systems. But before we dive into this topic, I think we should contextualize the point in time we are at as an industry and society with regards to dealing with climate resiliency and adaptation. We have all seen these numbers of growing insured and uninsured losses from weather events. But when you think about the size of the P&C insurance market, globally, these insured losses are still manageable. they account for less than 10%, somewhere between 5 and 6, depending on where you get your numbers, of the total P&C market. But the concern is that with changing weather patterns and growing NatCat risk, can we keep these losses manageable? Will it start to impact our industry and our ability to perform our economic role, which is helping individuals, companies, and governments mitigate and transfer risk? So this is a critical time for us to start acting on resiliency, and we need to ensure we take those preventative steps needed to keep this risk manageable. But we can't do it alone, and the Geneva Association report on safeguarding homeowners insurance clearly assigns responsibility to multiple stakeholders. This includes governments, policyholders, community leaders, and other financial institutions, among others. All these stakeholders need to consider the impact of growing NatCat risk when they take strategic action, or in other words, make more risk-informed decisions. And I think what the report really does well is it identifies the green shoots or the actions that are already being taken by different stakeholders in different geographies. And that's why today we've pulled together a great panel with diverse speakers bringing different global perspectives on this issue. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists, Leslie Chapman Henderson, President and CEO of Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, or FLASH, Fiona Cousins, Global Chief Operating Officer, ARUP, Kurt Vandenberg, Director General of DG Klima, European Commission, and Matthias Trusted, Head of Global P&C Alliance. Matthias, I hope I pronounced your name wrong. I checked with Google and they promised this was the way I should pronounce it. So there you go. Okay. So let's start with you, Leslie. Your organization partners with different states to help build resiliency. How do we pivot from reactive disaster response to prevention? You're on mute.
There you go. I wanted to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think I saw Fiona was coming to us at around midnight. So it's great to be here. So I've worked in this space for more than 25 years on resilience specifically, and in the industry for 12 years before that. And what we've seen over time is that resilience is about as complex as social change as we look to achieve. It does require leadership. It requires a very long-range outlook. And now, as we look at how to make it sticky, it requires a lifestyle change, a whole new way of looking at how we live and where we live, and cognizance versus simple tactics. So the thing that we have seen in the last, say, 5 years, and Andreas talked about this too, as did you, the market signals and the difficulties in the market, which are very real. And I see a dramatic change in terms of what used to happen. Typically, we'd have a disruption, it was fairly localized, we have solutions, and they mount over time. But today we see it is spreading, and that is the bad news. But the good news is that it is opening up minds and better conversations about how to use solutions to address the marketplace disruption, which is, of course, what this is all about. So when we talk about leadership, resilience leadership is not a traditional role, as many of the stakeholders that have to come together to deliver resilience are, right? Whether it's emergency management or insurance or building code officials, but resilience leadership is something we've always seen as a right role for our insurance regulatory and our insurance commissioner community, which is why we put a program together in a partnership with the U.S. National Association of Insurance Commissioners more than 5 years ago. These commissioners are the de facto risk managers for their states' economies. And so we did a study, we've been working with them, and we've created together a community of practice with resources, best practices, model legislation, and other assets to help them get to the core, one or all three of the core paths to resilience, either building code, possibly zoning leadership, that's one. And that takes care of the new construction, the future. The second is the mitigation grant incentives, opportunities to address older housing stock that hasn't had the benefit of being constructed or placed under new, more enlightened, risk-based thoughts. And then the third, which is really the ultimate driver, is the marketplace, where we create a culture of resilience tying into that lifestyle. So that work is growing, it's successful. It is not, I wouldn't say it's early days, but we're seeing some great acceleration there.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question for you. What are some of the hurdles that you face or we should expect to face when implementing some of these recommendations that you have?
Well, building codes are tough, and there's local reticence. There's often a misunderstanding. They definitely require that long-range outlook from leaders. Otherwise, it's not something that people want to embrace, because perceptions by critical stakeholders like home builders and realtors and others who may not see the near-term benefit, even though we need to embrace it. So one of the things we do is we reframe the value proposition of building codes, not just as a notion of what the price of a home is, but we need to look at the home, and the calculus, we believe, is what is the total cost of home ownership and the value proposition there to a homeowner, a community, and insurer for a durable, weather resistant home that can withstand those shocks over time. And so changing that conversation works. There's two examples right now, I think they're very stark here. California has had the epic wildfires, arguably one of the worst outbreaks, certainly one of the most costly, yet they're still struggling with whether or not to adapt very well established and researched engineering insights regarding embers, and just creating a simple 0 to 5 space around the home where the embers can come to die because there's nothing ignitable in the space. And they haven't yet embraced that, which I think tells us the difficulty of this. There's homeowner resistance there too. But conversely, in Florida, since Hurricane Andrew, which is when I began my resilience path, there has been a steady willingness to stick with strong building codes. And as Andreas mentioned, they have yielded tremendous successful results. Engineering post-event reports from Ian, Idalia, and all these other storms have shown that not just the wind code, but the floodplain management, the increased elevation, have delivered homes that bounce back quickly and well. And moreover, on the marketplace front, in 2024, we saw a drop after the 2023 average rate requests were around 14% for increases. That dropped to 8% in 2023, with more than 40 companies filed for either a decrease or zero increase. So the market heals, the homes stay, solid. And I think that this building code piece, we can't skip it, and we can't skip where we build either in risk-based zoning and still come out on top.
Thanks, Leslie. I think we should broaden this conversation to talk about the need for resiliency in larger infrastructure projects. So Fiona, thank you for joining us all the way at midnight from Australia. But shifting to you, what is needed to incorporate resiliency in infrastructure design and development? And what are some of the challenges in investing in retrofits of existing infrastructure?
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Hello. So I think that the place to start for me is to say I am an engineer, and so I tend to think about things through a design lens. And in this case, I mean design in a really broad sense of the word. So when you're trying to design something, when you're trying to put infrastructure together, one of the things that you think about is, what does it need to withstand? And while you're in that moment, when you're trying to understand what is actually needed, when you're trying to understand the problem, and then before you move to the stage where you iterate through ideas and proposals, you find that you're often in a gap between what people think they want and what they can actually have and what the code requires and so on. The problems can suddenly get very, very big, and everything can feel very, very connected. So it can be a confusing state. But when you're in that gap, those connections become really clear. So if you think about the delivery of mail, which is dependent on a series of different kinds of infrastructure, it depends on the transport system, which depends on the weather. And that depends also on the seasons, because that can impact the physical condition of, is it a road or is it a railway? And then you might think about other loads on the transport system. How busy is it? How well are they driving? Or if it's the mail, what are the labour conditions of the people delivering? So there's sort of all of these pieces that begin to come come together, and that is all happening in a sort of backdrop of changing climate resilience and changing climate and different and more extreme loads on those infrastructure systems, the hard infrastructure, than we otherwise might see. So the first point is actually to think in a holistic and systems-oriented way, the idea that everything is connected, but then also to think, okay, so what are the actually the points of failure in that, and is one point of failure okay, or actually do you have to fail 2 or 3 systems in order for that to begin to happen? What then kind of emerges out of that is, what are all the risks that might impact the system, and which ones of those are in control of the thing that you're actually trying to change or design or put together. And if there are different kinds of systems and different ways of impacting a system, what are you actually in control of? So if you're running a railroad and the electricity system fails, what are we looking at here? Are we looking at the failure of the rail system, or are we looking at the failure of the electricity system? And if those two things happen to go together, what does that actually mean? And who pays and who gets? So if you improve the resilience of the electricity system, the rail system automatically gets an improvement in the things that happen. So there's a sort of who pays, who gets, and then you tie into all of that, all of the things around insurance, which tends to be on a single asset or a single system basis, or a single location basis in the case of the town that was talked about in the previous presentation. But the benefits don't necessarily accrue to the people. The benefits either of insurance or of doing the work don't necessarily accrue to the people who are paying for it. So the first thing is you have to be holistic, and you have to think hard about what will impact the resilience of your particular piece of infrastructure, and then you have to work out which bits of that you're actually in control of, and what your levers for doing that are, whether it's a piece of hardened infrastructure or whether it's a code move. To your point, Leslie, if the better the codes, actually, the more likely it is that it will withstand a particular kind of disaster. And then in that, all of that is sort of in the backdrop of, and there are other things that are maybe changing as well. So while we always used to think about earthquakes in California, now we have to think about earthquakes and fire. And what if you get earthquakes and fire at the same time? And that then comes with, water that follows, rain, torrential rain that follows after that, then actually feeds into a whole other series of kind of inadequacies in the system. So you need a holistic view, but you then actually need to be really clear about what you can control, what other people can control, and where the best place to spend the money overall is, which may or may not be in your actual project. And then it becomes a much more social, political kind of question about how you actually make that work.
So we have trillions of dollars or billions of dollars going into building new infrastructure systems for the energy transition. Do you see efforts of incorporating resiliency against extreme weather to be a consideration in these projects?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the point I was making before. The electrical grid tends to actually be an underlying component, or something that is needed to work in order for almost anything else to work. Buildings don't work without power quite often, especially if they're tall. Railroads don't work without power, especially if they're tall. Distribution systems for other kinds of utilities don't always work. Cell phones don't work. So if you lose electricity, it's the fundamental system that underlies many of the other things. Without it, nothing else works. So of course we must be thinking about the resilience of those new energy systems against weather, because actually they underpin so many other systems that actually a failure in the energy system can be a failure that is replicated in all sorts of other ways across all sorts of other systems, as we know from some of the big power cuts that we've had in different places. So we should definitely be thinking about that. But there's a sort of question. It comes back to my earlier point about being holistic. Do you harden your solar panel array, or do you harden your wind array? Or actually is the issue that you need to make sure that you've got the opportunity for different kinds of power to arrive in different kinds of places, so that the overall electrical grid is resilient? And of course that's where you're aiming for, but that has consequences for how you might treat specific bits of generation or transmission infrastructure on the electrical system. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks, Fiona. Kurt, moving to you, we really do need the policy perspective here. And given the rising impacts of climate extremes, what are the European authorities doing to prepare for them?
Yes, Thank you, Raki, for having me on this panel, and thank you to the Geneva Association for devoting attention to climate risks and climate adaptation. This is not new for us in Europe. We have been working on climate adaptation and resilience for more than 10 years now. We have all had all kinds of strategies. But what we see is that our member states, or 27 governments in the EU, have not taken this seriously enough. And last year, we published the first ever science-based European Union climate risk assessment, from which it shows that Europe is warming at double the global rate of warming, which means that the climate extremes that we're currently living through will become the new normal at some point in the future, and probably rather sooner than later. And that comes not only with extreme events, but many also slow onset changes by drought, etc. So what it means for us is that we need to become much better prepared for this. We are not prepared for these climate impacts in the future. Obviously, we want to continue and will continue with reducing emissions. That's the first best. But it's no longer reducing emissions and nothing more. It's now reducing emissions and adapting, or what we increasingly say, making sure we become more resilient to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And that's why we are working on a whole of government approach to resilience by design, so that we can really instill a feeling and a policy of preparedness rather than only response. And that's why next year the Commission will present a whole new package of proposals, including legislation, as part of an integrated framework for climate resilience. And what we will want to do there is 5 things, basically. One is addressing the gap in risk ownership and risk governance. We need to make sure that the awareness of the risks that will be coming from climate change are understood across sectors of the economy, across policy areas, and at all levels of governance, from the local up to the European and back. One way we will promote this is to have EU-wide climate reference scenarios, so that we say Europe must, for example, be prepared for a 4 degrees warmer climate. What does this mean for energy, for transport, for public health, but also for the financial sector, for example, because the European Central Bank is increasingly worried by the risks to the stability of the financial system. And we will then make sure that all those sectors are being stress tested against the temperature scenario that we will agree together at European level. Secondly, we will implement resolutely the principle of resilience by design. We will develop requirements to make sure that all planning decisions are informed by future climate risks. Thirdly, that requires that, of course, everyone, wherever he or she is, has access to the tools, the data, the methods, the scenarios, so that he or she can understand what the impact will be of climate change. If you are a farmer in Greece or a utility in Finland, what does it mean if you do investments now? And how do you need to be, for what do you need to be prepared in 15, 20 years' time? So we will create a European market for climate services, climate intelligence, if you like. And that is then linked to the 4th point, which is solutions. We need to really create a single market in the EU for the climate solutions. We read in a recent report from McKinsey that the global market for climate adaptation or resilience solutions will be in the order of $600 billion to $1 trillion by 2030. That is a vast business opportunity. Some call it the business of doom, but it's a business that we can no longer afford to miss. We see that there is an enormous need and opportunity in terms of solutions for building resilience, for grids, water systems, cold chains and logistics, but also agriculture and food production. And what we will try to do is to make sure that those investments contribute to the competitiveness of companies so that they are better prepared for the coming risks, but that they also have a transformative effect on the quality of life of people. For example, by using nature-based solutions wherever that is most effective and cost efficient. And last point that we will address is the finance. We will need to mobilize a lot more finance for this. We use for that disclosure requirements on the part of corporates and banks and financial institutions. But we will increasingly be looking at financial instruments to better leverage private sector investments and make sure that there is a return on investment if those companies and private sector invest in climate resilience solutions. And obviously, we will work a lot. We are already working with the insurance sector. There is someone from Allianz on the panel. I believe it was someone from Allianz who said that climate change is on track to destroy capitalism. And that is not something that we want. If there is no more insurance provided, then that bodes very badly for the future of our economy. But I'm sure the gentleman from Allianz can talk much better to that than I can.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Matthias, let's move to you. I do have a multi-part question for you here. So for a long time, insurers have been promoting the need for risk-based pricing of insurance. Why is this risk-based approach very important? And what will it take to keep insurance affordable and available?
Thanks a lot. First of all, also from my side, it's great to be here. And I'm afraid there's going to be more repetition. It's already in the beginning, Brea said and Mariam. But let's talk about the what, and then maybe let's later on talk about the how. And never forget the why. First question, why is risk adequate crop pricing so important? We believe that it's really important because it only enables a market to function. If we have risk-based pricing, then we get both the right transparency as well as the right incentives to promote sustainable behavior in terms of where to build, what to build, and how to build. And just as much where, what, and how not to build. That's one of the fundamental problems that we're building in a way and in places where it's just not sustainable. And by sustainable, I don't mean in terms of CO2, in terms of building a house where you have an average return period of less than 10 years of a great flood. Why would you do that? And it seems that often the answer is, well, my insurance pays for it. But that can't be the solution. That can't be the answer, because first of all, we can't replace family photos. There's a lot of hardship. And ultimately, from a personal hardship perspective, as well as from a CO2 perspective, it doesn't make any sense to rebuild the same thing at the same place and then have it destroyed overall. It's a little bit like with a sand castle. It's fun for children, but you would never put your things when you know the flood is going to come, for sure. And that is one thing where risk adequate prices are really necessary, because otherwise, if you pay the same for a high risk area and a nice house, thinking, oh, well, insurance covers it, it leads to market inefficiencies. And as Leslie said early on, that is a really, really important signal. We need to talk about not just the building, but the total cost of ownership going forward, which is super hard. And I think I'm still struggling with that. And maybe that's something we can come up with. If it's so clear, and at the same time, we also know that there's a prevention payback, whether it's between 4 to 10 or 6 to 12 euros, that's a great business case, yet so little is happening. Why is that? And happy to come to that later, but that's why risk adequate pricing is super important. And I think also from the California example, unfortunately, we've seen what happens if you don't have it. If you cap risk premiums, if you're not allowing for forward-looking pricing, you get into a toxic mix of inadequate and not happening prevention. You get into an unaffordability and unavailability, and you have tremendous hardship for the people. If you look not just at the buildings burned down, if you look at the secondary effects of people having severe breathing problems from the air because things have been burning that should never burn, the whole infrastructure besides houses, there's so many very negative externalities. That's just not the way to go on. So much for risk-based pricing. In terms of your second question, what does it need or take to keep insurance available and affordable? It's, in our view, 3 pillars, and it's a bit like a chair that needs 3 legs in order to not fall over, as an example to think about it. The first one is what we call technical excellence, meaning risk-adequate premiums. For that, you need to have a proper risk understanding. You need to have the best possible risk understanding, which involves peril zones, which involves vulnerability assessments of infrastructure of buildings. The same way, it needs a lot of really high quality, unbiased, granular data. You also need to have a forward-looking view and an approach to say, what do we have today and how is this going to change? Because if we talk about a house, then this is going to be there, hopefully, for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So don't just need to look at the here and now, but also in terms of where's this going? What can be good and sufficient today may not be good and sufficient for tomorrow. So that's the first part, proper risk understanding, proper also accumulation management, insurance management. But that is not enough, because it can't address in an effective way the underlying risk. And we've been talking about risk transfer, but we need to talk, in my view, a lot more about risk management and risk reduction. I always think back to what Al Gore said, and it seems that he was a bit ahead of his time. An inconvenient truth. That might be one of the reasons why people and government so far couldn't be engaged in a way, and it's also on our part to help do that, to do the right thing. So the second part is really individual homeowner resilience, making homes more resilient, building back stronger, meaning when there is a claim, not just replacing the way it was earlier on, but say, oh, whoa, you're in a high hail risk area, the roof is gone, we can rebuild it in the same way, but then it's going to be gone the same way again. Maybe we should rebuild it stronger to prevent damage going forward, to reduce losses, both for the personal side as well as for the insurer, and it's more sustainable as well. So individual resilience building and prevention is a big thing. And then ultimately, that's the third leg, we need general infrastructure resilience, meaning cities need to adapt. If cities have all concrete and sealed floors, if there's not enough room to go for the water to go when there are heavy rains, you know what's happening. Same applies to doing proper cofferdams, doing proper preventive measures. Flooding is a big thing, especially now that with hotter air, you can get heavy rain events very far away from rivers. There's other perils as well, but in our view, flooding really is one of the major parts. And we need to prepare in terms of infrastructure. And I have to agree to court. There's been, after the devastating floods in Germany, a flood program, national flood program in 2013. And now 12 years later, sadly, 80% of what's been in the program hasn't even started yet. So if we continue in that speed, it's going to take 100 years. And climate change, unfortunately, is not going to wait for us. So looking at it from a positive side, there's a lot of infrastructure investments. We really need to make sure it goes the right way and play our part to make it more sustainable. And that ultimately, makes insurance available and affordable, and keep this world insurable, which, and let's come back to that later, goes also to the financial system. Just very briefly, if you don't get insurance for a house, it's going to become very difficult for the bank to finance it, because if you are putting money into an asset which might not be there or seriously impaired over the next years, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, good points, Matthias. I know we're going to run out of time, but we have lots more questions. So we have about 10 minutes. I'm going to do rapid fire, 2 core areas. One is on innovation and the other on collaboration. So rapid fire, Leslie, what do you see the role of innovation, for example, in building materials, construction approaches, etc., and how can this be expedited or adopted at scale?
So we do have good news on the front of leveraging, as Andrea said, AI, machine learning, 3D printing, and older, not as well accepted things like modular construction are finally making it into acceptance. But one of the things that's also happening is we're looking at existing ways that we build and re-examining them and rethinking them. And my favorite example right now, and it goes to one of the questions in the chat, So garage doors, for those of us who've been on the field on a ground post disaster, you see that wind failure, whether it's a hurricane, tornado, or even just a severe convective storm, typically begins with your largest and weakest opening, which is your garage door. Yet we only sell wind resistant and impact resistant doors in the hurricane zones, mostly Florida. So NIST has established, the National Institute for Standards and Technology did a correlation analysis. So we now have proof points that show in wind speeds up to 135, if the garage door was intact. In Joplin, they looked at 3,000 homes, the roof and adjacent walls were as well. So this has given us a ticket to come into the center of the country where severe convective storms last year caused more losses than the cat losses. And that was a question in the chat as well. If the simple fix in many cases is a stronger garage door, where do we take that? So we're working with that industry, convening the science folks who did not know anything about how the product manufacturer saw it. There's an 81% market opportunity with the simple sale of a better door. So innovation doesn't have to be fancy, although it is very cool and very fancy in many instances. It can also just be looking at how we're doing it today, making it better.
Thanks. Fiona, again, what engineering and from a engineering and design perspective, what innovations, approaches, or standards should become non-negotiable in resilient infrastructure projects? You're on mute. We can't hear you.
All right, let's try that button. Hello. So I think the thing that is non-negotiable is actually taking a multi-hazard approach to the asset that you're trying to deal with. Engineering is extremely good. Engineering designers are extremely good at working out what you can do with the money and how to best kind of mitigate what's there in a very practical and tactical way. They harden buildings and infrastructure in very good ways, but a lot of the problems that are really here are about the organizational and political environment within which those things are being built. Can you build it in rebuilding in the same place rather than rebuilding in a new place? All of those conversations actually become very, very difficult. And there's a question about what are we actually prepared to tolerate as a society through policy. So the engineering innovations are actually quite straightforward. It's look at everything, figure out what's most important, and then design for that. But the sort of how do you make sure that you don't necessarily have to make a home resilient to flood if the city has figured out how to make itself resilient to flood, or if you have managed somewhere in the watershed to mitigate the downstream water flows. There are different things that different people can do that have different impacts on other people, and in many cases it's a political rather than a very local asset based answer that is actually better.
I think we are all looking at affordable housing being an issue, and how can you ensure that you build resiliency in homes while keeping homes affordable?
No, you're right, Raki. Affordability, but also quantity and quality of housing is a big issue. Today, there are elections in the Netherlands, and housing shortages is one of the big priorities in that election campaign. So there will have to be a lot more houses built. And for that, we have a policy of promoting climate proofing so that we apply the principle of do no significant harm. So that when you build new houses, you don't do harm to the environment, but you also make sure that from the outset, you look at what are the changing climatic conditions that you will face over time. The second thing is that we are pushing a big program for renovating old houses. That's necessary for our climate goals to reduce emissions and phase out the use of fossil fuels in Europe. But while doing this, we increasingly bring in the whole dimension of climate resilience, so that people see that when they renovate their house, it's not only more comfortable and cheaper by using heat pumps, for example, but that they also have better assurance and confidence that it will better withstand the shocks and impacts from climate change. You probably know that, for example, in a country like France, there are millions of houses that are at risk of cracking because of droughts. And that is something that we really want to tackle on more in a more systematic manner.
Thank you. Matthias, what are the most promising innovations from the insurance side that can encourage businesses and households to invest in prevention and resiliency?
I think it's really supporting customers with what actually helps to reduce the risk, and ultimately then also reflecting that in insurance premiums. In terms of engaging with governments, we're working on being able to simulate different infrastructure measures and then analyzing what the payback is, to not just inform the government, but ideally also inform the people, to get more public pressure to invest into resilience measures, which are not always totally popular when they're there, but they should be very popular when they're not there. In hindsight, to then invest in the future, to come out of this paradox. Partnerships, I think, is super important, and I'm very, very happy to be together here, and I'd be very happy to continue that, to really drive this forward and ultimately get the right incentives. There's two questions, but I'm taking them later because you said shoot, so I'll shut up for now.
Yeah, no, and I know we're going to run out of time, so Mariam, I'm going to take 5 minutes from you, because I'm going to ask one question to each of you. It's the same question. I'm not going to go person by person, but we need to talk about collaboration. The Geneva Association report clearly says we cannot do it alone. It has to be done in a collaborative manner. From your perspective, what is the one or two things you think we absolutely have to work together on, given your area of expertise? So Leslie, let's start with you, then Fiona, Gert, and then Matthias. Go ahead.
I think we need to lean in, support, celebrate, and learn from those builders and developers who are doing it right, and help the marketplace lift that up and continue it. We've got Babcock Ranch in Florida, first solar city that also withstood Hurricane Ian. And now we have KB Homes. And I see Dan's coming on next. In California, the first wildfire prepared home community. That's where it gets down to for all the policy, research, and everything else we do. Until these things are put into action, it doesn't really matter. So I think we have to really focus there. And I see very promising trends. I'm hopeful. And after all these years, that community is getting it, and insurance is the reason. But that's okay, because it's solving it. And I think there's a lot more of that to come.
Fiona?
I think the one thing I would like to see is sort of a little bit of a greater understanding around how we plan for the risks that are coming. Because I think we have a little bit of a tendency sometimes to plan for the thing that happened last rather than the thing that happened next. And in a multi-hazard environment, you end up in a place where you've strengthened everything against flood, and what happens next is actually a drought, or you strengthen everything against flood, and what happens next is actually a wildfire. And I think just really understanding that these things can be overlapping, and that more than one thing can happen in one place. I think there's always a tendency to plan for the thing we've just had rather than the thing that we might be most likely to get next.
Thank you. Gert?
Well, I see three quick points for collaboration. One is sharing of data and models and scenarios, so that there is a much better understanding and awareness of what is coming to us in the future, and fight disinformation on this. That's very important, we believe. Second is to work together on doing climate proofing of new investments, new purchases, in a way that the climate proofing is rewarding and not experienced as punitive on the investor or on the buyer of a good, of a hose, or of whatever. And thirdly, looking at how to maximize the co-benefits of resilience investments. Let me give you one example. Science tells us that if you green a city in order to better withstand the heat stress by bringing in more nature, that also has a positive impact on mental health of the people living there and on the value of the houses. It means that, for example, health insurance schemes could be interested in investing in the greening of a city, because over time it lowers its bill for taking care of people that suffer from mental health issues. So these I see as 3 areas. There are many others, but these are really ones that come to my mind.
Interesting. Matthias, you have the last word.
Thanks. I think one of the key issues really is in how do we bring what we know, and it seems that we all agree, to the people to get a real world effect, and excuse that saying, to not preach to the choir, which is nice, but which is not changing something. How can we effectively work together? What do we need in terms of regulation? What do we need in terms of understanding? What do we need in terms of education and support of the people to say, this is not what you need to do, this is what you should want to do to really make it happen? Because it's a great way going forward, but for some reason it doesn't seem to be as transparent and as clear as it should be. That's my major thing, to not just talk about, really make it happen in the real world.
Thank you. Mariam, let's pass it on to you for Q&A, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rocky and the group. Great discussion. Many questions has come up, and not to say we have about 80 that was sent to us earlier. So I'm going to need less than 1 minute responses because we want to cover a lot of areas. The questions are of 2 nature, focusing on how do we change behavior to be able to invest in resilience and the value of resilience. And there are tons of questions about mitigation, that in the, to deal with resilience, we need to invest a lot more in climate mitigation. So just to give you the gist of it. So let's take on the whole issue of stakeholder behavior, particularly when it comes to homeowners, mortgage lenders, real estate, builders, and so on. And the first question is currently the price of real estate and the mortgages that we get represent the risks that homes in high-risk areas have? And should we continue to value homes high and give cheap mortgage to homes that are located in high-risk areas? Leslie, I want to ask you that because you've been fighting this battle of resilience. Then I also want to ask maybe Kurt, as part of your strategy, knowing that you are at the EU level and this is a very local level, how are we going to change systems that are enabling people to live in high-risk areas, such as real estate and mortgage? Leslie and Kurt?
So we are continuously doing behavior-focused studies in order to affect change and change behavior. And there are some cornerstone, continuous throughout. People do not understand their risks. They assume the best. They're confident that they aren't at risk. And so you first have to impart that. And that's why transparency is a major focus, because armed with transparency, whether it is a mortgage company or a buyer or a realtor, it changes the equation. People tell us all the time, I had no idea. I did not know. And as basic as that sounds, that's where we are. We don't have this connect the dots where they look at a place far away and they say, that doesn't happen here. And it's human bias. They check out and they don't do it. We're not trying to scare people into good decision making. We're just trying to empower them. And when we do that in a way that puts them in charge, it works. And that's why we have some tools. And I think we talked about putting some of those in the chat or sharing them later. We have lookup tools for you now. You can put in your address. It's going to tell you your risks. It's going to tell you your options. And it's going to put you in charge of whether or not you can adapt your home to be what it needs to be.
Thank you so much. Kurt, maybe you can look from a bigger policy that, is it just about governments and that, but what about other sectors that have a role to play in enabling people to live in high-risk zones? Can there be policies around that to prevent that?
I would agree with Leslie that it's really a question of empowering people. The government cannot be expected to do everything, but obviously it has a role to play. We have to facilitate an environment where people have access to data, as I previously said, so that people understand in what area they live and what are the risks. Secondly, the market will also take care of this increasingly, because insurance companies will withdraw from high-risk areas or make the insurance products much more expensive. So already the market will take care of this. And lastly, I think what we also will see happen is, given the enormous need for public funds for reconstruction and rebuilding after climate extreme events, we probably will go to a situation where it will be clear that such funds and support will only be made available if in a certain area communities have invested in the necessary resilience measures.
This is fundamental. I think Andreas Berger also referenced that communities that are already buying insurance to take the faith of their own in terms of that. We see that in Germany. Local governments have been mandated by federal government to actually buy their own insurance if, so that, they pay for the risk that are being generated at that level. So I think what you're saying is a very important point that, to make sure that those issues are tackled. Now, resilience has been seen more as cost than value proposition. However, around the world, we are seeing example after example where collaboration of government, insurance, builders and others are leading to resilience implementation that are generating value for the homeowner, higher home prices and so on. Any reflection on some of the best practices you've seen around the world that you would like to just make a call to? Matthias, Leslie, Kurt, and Fiona, particularly in infrastructure, are there examples in the world that you see these kind of measures are being undertaken and with a demonstrated value generation?
Maybe very quickly to start, what I think is great to also close the loop to what Leslie and Kurt have said. If you look at Flood Re in the UK, they support homes that have been built pre-2009 because they might not have known, and also support them. And I think that's where the government can come in to say, okay, you have a problem here. What can we do to strengthen the home? While at the same time preventing new buildings when you have the knowledge, which are not sustainable. I think to really get into that loop, to not create more problems and solve the existing problems, that would be a great way to go forward. And the UK Flood Re system, I think, is a good example of that.
Anybody else would like to answer that in your respective fields?
Well, maybe one positive example. I'm Belgian, and the Belgian government has analyzed the risks of rising seas at the Belgian coast. And they studied this for years. And at the end, what they have decided is that it's much more cost efficient to rebuild natural dunes than great dikes, which in turn has big benefits for attracting tourism, for example. And these are the positive stories that we need more and more. A negative example, I think, is what happened in Valencia last year, where at the first anniversary of the floods in Valencia, where people are really very, very angry that the lessons have not been learned from there. And that is something we really need to take to heart. As also Matthias was saying, we are learning lessons, but translating these lessons into real practice, we still have a long way to go.
Thank you so much. Now, there are many questions about mitigation of climate change. The point that, we are dealing with rising risk of extreme weather. Part of it is because, is the world doing enough to scale up mitigation measures? So there are questions that I would like to have asked to Allianz and to Rahi, you as Liberty Mutual. What are insurance companies doing to enable and expedite climate mitigation? I will have you start, Rahi, and then Matthias. I know because I work with you, but I want to hear it from your own.
Yeah, so Liberty Mutual, along with many other insurers, are very much focused on enabling and supporting the transition by leaning in to understand the core risks that are needed to be mitigated in technologies or when it comes to infrastructure building, on resiliency, getting that integrated approach. So whether it is also participating in different industry groups, such as the ones that you've put together, Mariam, to develop standardizations, if possible, on certain risk profiles. So the only way you can get these new technologies adopted and scaled is if you have insurance. And what it needs is for us as insurers to understand these risks. And often we are advising on early on in the design process to reduce risks along the way so that you build much more resilient, as well as reduce the cost is reduced overall in the project. So that's in a quick my answer, but Matthias, to you.
Not totally different, Rashi. Obviously doing our part as a corporate, but besides that, really creating that transparency. We also have this tool we can just key in your address to find out what's happening with your home, but then also providing a solution and not just increasing insurance prices because we must, but really saying, what do you need to do and what can you do to reduce the price? What can you do to make your home more valuable for the future? And then ideally also providing links or cooperations with people who can do it and who can actually help, as well as ideally joining up with governments. That would be the best thing to say. You also get an extra support to, for example, change your oil heating in a highly affected area, because if you have an oil tank in the cellar and you get flooded, you don't just contaminate but all the other buildings around you just as well, which is not sustainable.
Excellent. I'm going to ask one last question to Fiona, and it's just a quick response. Unfortunately, we don't have time for closing remarks. I assume that the question that Rahi asked you about collaboration really hits on that. But Fiona, we are going to spend billions of dollars in new infrastructure systems. And you kept talking about the disjointed approach to building infrastructure in project finance. You talked about systemic approach. Can you elaborate? What does that mean in reality on the ground from the point we decide to where to build the infrastructure? Can you come back and tell us a little bit more about the kind of reforms we need to do in this area to build more resilient infrastructure systems of the future?
So when I was talking to our resilience experts in the firm about this, and we were talking between ourselves, the thing that came out kind of most strongly from everybody's reflections on it was that there is an enormous amount of uninsured risk. That while there are some places where you can do something and you can get a benefit on your insurance as well as getting a benefit because you've actually reduced your risks. If you take a sort of total financial view of that, if you've reduced your risk and you've reduced your insurance, actually you're in a much better place than otherwise. But we don't, and probably shouldn't, let people get hurt when something is underinsured or not insured at all from a risk standpoint. So the sort of the overarching piece was that actually as a society we are essentially underinsured. We allow the governments to pick things up at the end. There isn't an appetite for people managing their risk in the way that there should be. So while there are some very good examples, and many of them have come up today, the impression that I got was, or the impression that I got through our sort of combined reflections as we were talking about it, is actually something a little bit more depressing and distressing, which is that actually we are not moving in any way fast enough on this, and that there are lots of things that are underinsured or uninsured, and that actually is a problem because we do let governments pick it up as a point of last resort, because actually we don't want our people to get hurt wherever they are. And that I think is kind of was the underlying theme of all of the things that were in our conversation.
Thank you so much. On a very, very bright note, I was just attending the IEA, International Energy Agency, and I think the conversation is shifting that, we need to take measures, we need to be responsible for risk with that resilience measure. So I think what I'm hoping is that a lot of the conversation about resilient infrastructure as a blind spot for the society is going to be tackled with the views that you're talking about looking ahead. So with that, thank you very much to panel one for the great moderation by Rahi and great engagement by our panelists. We actually are 3.5 minutes over, which means that we will just take a 2-minute break. If you need to get yourself a glass of water or what, and stand up and sit down, and we will try to start on time the next panel. So thank you very much, and back in 2. See you soon.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, we're back. And I guess this conversation, along with many conversations we've had throughout the year, just points out to the complexity of the issues at hand. Yet, I myself am deeply encouraged because I see alignment in our discussions with governments, within the insurance industry, with other critical sectors, from industrials to commercials. And I think what I'm essentially alluding to, I think momentum is starting to pick towards the importance of these issues. And we got work to do. There's no question that we got a lot of work to do. Now, with that, I'd like to move to panel 2. And in this panel, we decided to take a specific peril, in this case, wildfires, and look at how innovation and prevention is changing the way we manage wildfires. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jacqueline Lesage, Managing General Partner at Munich Re Ventures, who has dedicated a lifetime to a lot of these issues. And she will be moderating this session. I will jump in 35 minutes into this session to try to facilitate the Q&A with the audience. And by the way, for the audience who has put a lot of questions and you don't feel it's been answered, we're going to try to sort of reframe them and see if panel 2 can get to some of your questions. So I'm going to be very mindful of that. So with that, thank you, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miriam, for your extensive work putting together these important materials and reports and also this conference, and for including me on the panel. So building on what Miriam talked about during the opening of the conference and then in the prior panel, I plan to focus this panel on 5 topics, all through the lens of wildfires: incentivizing stakeholder behavior change, scaling solutions through cross-sector collaboration, technology and AI innovation, venture capital and reinsurance partnerships, systemic risk and future resilience. In my own work, the complexity of the stakeholders has seemed analogous to a tragedy of the commons almost. It's everyone's problem, but it's no one's problem. We see this in situations such as incenting homeowners towards the steps or choices that they can take to address their exposure vulnerabilities and harden their properties, or in the funding of the infrastructure and services to protect our communities, and also in the venture capital markets where I participate, such as when we see startups with very compelling technologies, but a challenging situation for going to market and scaling, often due to the lack of a single buyer with money to spend. At the same time, I've become more hopeful from some of the work of my colleagues on this panel that there are already in existence very practicable ways to align these many varying interests, or even to create financial incentives, both insurance and non-insurance, that move the needle and can potentially be inspiration for others to learn from. Let's start with a first question to hear about some of these directly from the panelists. If there's one thing over the past year or two that has given you the kind of hope that I just described, what is it? To not make it a spoiler for the remaining conversation, please just say what the one thing is, and we'll likely get a chance to come back to it. Let's start with Dan, and then Kate, then Mike, then Antoine.
Well, good morning, and yes, thank you for including me in this conversation. CBIA represents the home builders in California. The one thing I'm excited about is gaining a much better understanding of fire science and how to build entire communities that don't burn down through new technologies, new fire science, and just maintaining much more sophisticated codes in the building of our housing. So those are just some of the key components that I see where we're changing as an industry and changing as a society and actually embracing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's hear from Kate.
I think the thing I'm most excited about, because we're seeing it play out here, is the willingness of households and communities to want to do something and actually want the information, want the pathway out, and want to see their communities sustainable. And all the players that are involved in supporting them, has taken, in our view, decades to get to this point, and that's really encouraging.
We're certainly seeing that play out where I am in Northern California. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, from a technology standpoint, wildfire has gone from somewhat of a backwater or a niche space where it was 3 or 4 years ago to being very mainstream. You can see that from the amount of capital flowing in, the number of participants, the quality of the entrepreneurs, the number of startups that are coming across, and even the amount of attention and attendees that you get at events like this one.
Antoine.
Yes, talking about big corporates that we support for adaptation at AXA Climate, I will say that the level of awareness for top management on big corporates has significantly increased in a good way. They know that there is a big problem now. And the second element of hope, they understood that the recipe of success for adaptation will come from local, and they cannot adapt their companies by their own. And they need to rely on communities and to have a systemic approach in order to tackle the challenge of wildfires.
Thank you. So that gives us a bit of an optimistic tone to start on. So let's dive into the first topic. So research shows that homeowners prioritize quality of life and cost of living over extreme weather risks, whether it's fire, flood, or other risks. And the overall system seems to enable this. For example, the Geneva Association research shows that in the US, 57% of homes built in 2023 were in high-risk zones. In Germany, as many as 2,400 new buildings are added to high-risk flood zones annually. And in the UK, 8% of new homes constructed since 2013 are in flood-prone areas. So this is true across all of the different risks. Clearly, people are not incentivized to make what I'll call prevention-positive choices. Dan, you've been around these topics over the course of your career, most recently in working with builders in California. How do we incentivize stakeholder behavior change to prevent these risks?
The question I'm often asked is, why do you continue to build in these community areas that are suspect or subject to fires? Two things that come to mind. One is price. So there's a lot of pressure from both greenhouse gas reduction and fire risk to build in the urban cores in California. To build more than 4 stories costs 5 times more than to build a single-story home in a suburban neighborhood. So one, you just price families out of buying in areas that maybe you would prefer. The second thing is we don't look at risk holistically. The biggest risk in California is not wildfire. I know this because I work for Governor Schwarzenegger, and we analyzed every square inch of the state. The biggest risk is earthquake. And actually, the biggest risk for fire is conflagration following earthquake. So part of this is kind of a misnomer that, hey, you're building in fire-prone areas. If you build in downtown San Francisco, you're building in a fire-prone area. It's just fire-prone from earthquake. So a lot of it has, though, to do with the fact of 2 things: price and consumer preference. And consumers who have small children or even just retire prefer not to be on the 15th floor of a building, but like to walk outside to their backyard, turn on the barbecue, and have some friends over. And that's the American way. It might have to change, but that's really what drives the consumer interest in our products and why we build in those areas. The last thing I would say is just the reality that when you look at preparing for fire, we do believe we can build wildfire-safe communities and entire neighborhoods. We're doing it. So there are ways to even build adjacent to wildland-urban interface areas and do so in a fire-safe manner. And with that new technology, we think it's a game changer and something that will help us address this issue of wildfire and fire following, either whether it's an earthquake or just a regular community built in the suburbs adjacent to what we call wildland-urban interface. Thank you.
Kate, how does that resonate with you from what you've seen in Australia, particularly with homeowners also?
Yeah, I think we face similar issues. So there's a housing shortage here and a lot of pressure on our local governments to release land. And one of our real challenges is mostly around flood. So we have historically and continued to release land in flood-prone regions. And there's this intersection now of where the most financially vulnerable are also living in the most physically vulnerable places. And So that puts a lot of pressure on those households. There's no disclosure at the moment. We're working on that, but there's no real disclosure on the level of risk, and also, you know, how well those communities and buildings would perform. So people, I think, fairly don't have that information when they're making those decisions. We've got a lot of population growth, high demand for housing, and there's lots of competing interests there that are really creating a perfect storm of increasing that risk. So I think, you know, what we're all looking for are those innovations that help us actually find those pathways through those competing interests so that we can still create, you know, really resilient communities and make them sustainable.
And there are examples of some things that we have seen working, right? So there's programs like in the state of Alabama's Strengthen Homes initiative in the US, which is being adopted for wildfires in California. I think there's Dixon Trail, California, which aims to become a wildfire prepared neighborhood. And then Freecade, Australia's bushfire resilience rating app, which seems to have measurably reduced risk and costs at the property level. But yet these climate risks are still systematically overlooked in decision-making throughout the property life cycle. So back to you, Kate, maybe thinking about the bushfire resilience rating, what coordination mechanisms or governance structures can better align incentives across all the different stakeholders, developers, builders, mortgage lenders, insurers, and governments in order to accelerate adoption?
Yeah, I think what we've found is the complexity of information is overwhelming and leads to inaction. So over the last 11 years, and it's taken that long to sort of build up these resilience ratings, and starting with bushfire, but they cover flood and cyclone storm and heat wave as well now, that we have to be able to translate that complexity, the risk and exposure and the building performance into something that people can understand. And that's obviously really important for consumers, but it's actually really important as a market mechanism, because we need to be able to, and have been able to, integrate that measure of resilience into insurance pricing, reinsurance pricing, banking and lending, and also government grants. So I think being able to standardise that information, disclose it, but also importantly have that action plan available for free to everybody, starts to democratise the ability to understand your risk and take action. But you're right, the incentives around that have been really important, although we did notice that when we released the bushfire resilience rating, which has a self-assessment app and certification that enables those insurance and finance incentives, we released that before we released the incentives. So we had 6 months of that out in market without any financial incentives at all. And that was actually our highest uptake. So 50,000 people completing their assessments, and 17,000 of those taking at least 3 of those recommended actions, and we could measure that risk reduction without the incentives. So that was really encouraging, but of course the incentives help and enable a much deeper repricing of that risk when we can measure it and prove it. So it has required, you know, really strong governance and independence. So keeping all that expertise and the measure for those resilience ratings and the methodologies independent, but then partnering with investors and insurers and reinsurers and banks and governments to actually each pull their own lever that helps incentivise households to take some action.
So Kate, in both your answers, you talked a lot about informing the consumers, and then you also said that informing them can be enough to inspire action. I'm curious, though, you also mentioned the impact on mortgage rates and insurance and home valuation incentives. What were some of those specifics that were incentives that were implemented there?
Yeah, so at the moment, we've got half the insurance market here recognising the ratings. So consumers then can take their certified rating to those insurers, and they don't previously you'd have to sort of try and negotiate with an insurer and tell them the things that you might have done, and it really difficult sort of process, and you might not get any recognition for those actions. And so there's no system that brought the whole industry together. So now a consumer just takes that rating to any insurer to get their premium repriced and get those discounts. With banks, it's I guess two mechanisms that we use with the banks. One is to reduce their mortgage insurance interest rates. So just, to be able to recognise that risk reduction to that asset, but also to, in addition, if people need capital to actually do the retrofitting, that banks will provide a discounted rate to be able to undertake those building works. So, and then reinsurers, of course, being able to, in the same way as insurers, reprice that risk as well. So that's been happening for the last 12 months, and just obviously working with those industries through the peak bodies, but also individually as organisations to help their underwriting and pricing teams. It's a huge effort. It's taken 11 years. Like it's not an overnight success. It's been an enormous amount of work, but the outcome is good in that repricing that risk is nice and deep, and that's providing really good outcomes for consumers.
Great, thank you. Dan, can you talk similarly about some of the community scale wildfire prevention solutions that you've seen in California?
You bet. And it's just interesting to hear Kate's perspective. I wish some of that would come into California. So a few things. I mean, we, since 2010, we have really changed our code process for building homes in wildfire-prone areas. So we have, it's called Code 7A. It's our code process, but we kind of 4 key factors that have really changed things for us, and have actually the numbers back it up. It's as simple as siding, roofing, windows, and eaves. And as a result of that, that's really helped us to build wildfire resistant communities. We've taken it to a whole nother level and working with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety and asking them, like, we think we're doing a good job, but we're still not getting insurance. Some of that's part of our rate regulatory process, which isn't working right, but part of it is just not understanding that things have changed since 2010. The most recent thing, you touched on it in your introduction, Jacqueline, is this Dixon community down in Escondido, Southern California, and we built the first IBH certified wildfire prepared neighborhood. So it's 64 homes that are built to the highest standard. Then the new standard we've added is what we like to call it the safety zone, but the technical term is zone 0, which is within 5 feet of every building, there's nothing flammable. And so if you go to IBHS, you go to our website, you'll see that we have worked with IBHS to modify or look at 2 different building structures, one built to the old standards, one built to the new standards, and show how it doesn't burn if you build right. The next step we've taken is to do that, as I pointed out, community-wide. And then the biggest step we're taking is doing that in an entire master plan community-wide. So not just 64 homes, but 6,400 homes or 16,400 homes. You literally plan the neighborhood entirely to be prepared for fire. And what we do differently there is we use the water that's flushed in your toilets and it comes down your shower. We actually sanitize it, but we water the hillsides. They're green year round, even if it's 100 degrees out. We surround the homes with citrus, which don't burn, at least not quickly. We put in golf courses and man-made lakes and other things around the homes, and then we built these high fire standards. We put multiple fire stations within these areas, and we actually assess every homeowner, not much, $25, $50 a month, but we monitor this daily. So as you know, Munich Re and other insurance companies, the question is, yeah, it looks good today, but what's going to look like a year from now? Well, we can tell you what's going to look like tomorrow for the next 365 days in the next 3 years, 10 years. So that's where we're changing the way we build communities. And the stats are real. Less than 1% of the homes that have burned down in the state of California, even though we've had horrific fires, less than 1% have been built since 2010. And so that's just something, and no master plan community, not one, has suffered from a major conflagration. Maybe a kitchen fire, that happens every so often. But as far as a community being impacted like we've seen in in Paradise and Pacific Palisades and Altadena, Those are not master plan communities built since 2010. So that's the new steps we've taken because it is an attainability, a price point, but we believe there are ways to build communities holistically that don't burn, but also maintain themselves in a manner that an insurer can take the risk with a degree of certainty and realize this isn't just one and done. This is a daily commitment to fire safety.
That's really interesting. And it also, I think, creates potentially a solution for some of the things we're going to talk about now in terms of technology and AI innovation, in terms of bringing together a whole community to create and coordinate perhaps a buyer of different sorts of technologies and innovation. So in recent years, as Mike alluded to, the venture capital system, we've seen a tremendous amount of new company formation to address risk and resilience from extreme weather. Technology founders have been pushing the edge of innovation in wildfire prevention specifically, such as AI-enabled camera networks, ultra-heavy lift drones, IoT sensor networks, robotic machines that can perform precise controlled burns, and coordination platforms managing millions of acres of forest land. So I think the question is, how does this technology and AI innovation play into preventing this rising challenge? Mike, as an active venture capital investor, how do you see this?
Yeah, I think, first of all, well said in terms of the state of play, Jacqueline. I think those are definitely areas where we see a lot of interest in innovation bubbling. You know, we kind of think of fire tech investing on a continuum, starting with prevention and preparation, moving forward to detection, early detection and suppression, and then continuing to recovery. I think the heart of that is where we're seeing the most kind of scalable innovation today, the most mature companies. You touched on, sensors, detection, drone swarms. I also would just point out the complete proliferation of data sources, not just cameras in the field, but also sensor packages on fixed wing aircraft, on rotorcraft, on satellites looking down, integrating with, field observations and distributed networks of, fire watchers. And I think where AI kind of comes in and scales that is that it creates the ability to fuse all these disparate data sources into a common operating picture for the first responders on the ground who need to understand the boundaries of a fire, predict how it's going to behave, and then prioritize their interventions, right? And that general category, I think, is very investable today. There's a lot of great technology and some really mature companies. You also asked about prevention, and that's where I think it starts to get trickier, right? Prevention's an area where you often have this quandary of who pays. And on top of that, you have a collective action problem, right? And so, forest thinning, prescribed burning, utility vegetation management, these are categories that have incredibly high ROI if you think of them from, the big picture, from a social cost, social impact standpoint. But they're also really expensive, they're labor intensive. Where we see some bubbling innovation is really in this area of force multiplication. So using technology to help the people on the ground to prioritize and scale their efforts. And there, I think, some promising technologies, remote controlled masticators, robotic and roving pyrolysis units to clear brushland and thin forests, using software for utilities to sample and monitor their entire transmission corridors as opposed to a small sampling every year. These are areas where I think you're starting to see some real potential, and we need to see more.
Yeah, that buyer issue is definitely something we see all the time. Antoine, what's the perspective from the insurance industry about how technology and innovation can help to address these issues and incorporate into the insurance world, and whether it's for assessing, predicting, or responding to wildfire risks?
Thank you, Jacqueline, for the question. First, I will say that beyond technology, the key element of success is to bring the awareness of ExCom at the board level about the cost of wildfires. We need to put money on it. What is the cost of being impacted by wildfires? And not only directly on your property, wildfires impacting your property, but what we call the snowball effect. If you have communities impacted by wildfires, they cannot move, they cannot work, and all this systemic view of the risk is not well spread in terms of awareness across organizations. So if you want to use technology, you need to invest and buy this technology. So you need to be clear about the global cost of wildfires at the board level in order to bring accountability at the board level on this serious risk assessment. So in technology, I will give you one concrete example, which is what we provide at AXA Climate, which is parametric insurance. So we rely on satellites in order to trigger payout for customers based on our assessment of pictures from satellites. So we have a look at forestry management surfaces. When we see that there is burn area, we trigger a pre-amount of money predefined with the customers in order to put the money to reduce the damage in real time. And it's quite valuable when you are forestry managers and you are impacted by wildfires. But beyond technology, if you look at the causes of wildfires aggravation, acceleration, if I take, for example, of Portugal, very impacted, severely impacted country in Europe, you see that climate change is one factor, but the two other factors are, of course, vegetation. And my main message is we need also to tackle the topic of monoculture. As long as we keep just one species of tree in one area at the globe, we are at risk, be it because of diseases or wildfires. So the ability to orchestrate differently the vegetation and the cultures of the area is one key factor of prevention. And the other is communities, of course. How do we revamp the way we live in our places? We see, for example, in Portugal, many people coming to Portugal for tourism in summer, the most risky period of time. So beyond technology, and I agree with Mike, the prevention in order to be tackled need also to leverage other dimensions, especially the people and the business model aspect of places.
That's interesting because Mike and I both highlighted the challenge of having a single buyer, but there's also the challenge of a single decision maker. So in the examples that you gave, Antoine, who's going to decide what the vegetation should be?
It's for me, Jacqueline?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
The beauty of adaptation is the fact that the answer is complex. For me, it's part of why it's interesting. It brings me enthusiasm. Why? Because it's a complete revamping on the way we collaborate locally in order to drive the public decision. Unfortunately, in Europe, we have no more money in terms of public institutions. I caricaturate a bit. So we need to rely on big corporates also. So part of my job is to bridge a gap between private sectors and public sectors in order to have this dialogue and to be sure that we invest in common. But in order for big corporates to invest in what we call places, public topics, they need to understand the risk. So I go back to the point of awareness. If they do not embrace the systemic view of the risk, they do not understand why they should invest and put money to protect the places and the territories. So for me, it's starting from scratch, I would say, in terms of governance. So we need to bring to open spaces and room for this kind of transversal collaboration. But the maturity is quite low, especially in France. I know more France than other countries. So we have still a long journey to pursue in order to bring this kind of collective discussion.
Thank you. So now let's switch to our final topic of systemic risk and future resilience, which I think we already started touching on. So with insured losses of more than 100 billion a year now the new normal for natural catastrophes, and in wildfire, less than 40% of losses are typically insured, this question is open to the group. How do we balance immediate wildfire risk mitigation with building long-term community resilience that can adapt to an increasingly volatile climate?
I'll jump in here first, but that's a great question. I mean, a couple of things, this may surprise you, but I do think accurate pricing of insurance is a really important tool to determine the real risks associated with fire or any of our risks associated with living, or whether it's flood or earthquake. or wind. And so we're especially seeing this in California, but you see this in flood, where conservative Republicans in Texas are opposed to higher flood rates because it's not politically correct, even though the risk is profound. And so for us, I mean, this may sound funny, or kind of not what you'd expect, but when you don't have accurate pricing of risk, you really don't determine what the risk is. And so we believe that communities that take steps, whether it's even existing an older community, where they come in and form a fire safe council and look at it holistically, because home by home doesn't protect fire, but has to be community-wide that protects for fire, to really incentivize that behavior, to reward that behavior, and allow insurers to price for that behavior and let the market truly dictate where we build. And so that's one of the challenges we see is when we put in a community that is fire resilient, we're seeing that, there's just not the mechanism to say, hey, we're going to reward that with lower insurance costs. So that flexibility to hear kind of what Kate was talking about, where you incentivize and reduce mortgage costs and take a certificate. And if you as a community could take a certificate and go to insurers saying, we have done this, assuming you can get accurate pricing, that to us is a fantastic move to address this risk issue. And so if you can't, which is where California's at, we brag about the fact we have the lowest insurance rates. We also have the highest residual market growth in the history of the planet with our FAIR plan. So it's not working, it's failing. So the more we can allow for accurate pricing, that's a really positive step. And then it does reward the good behavior, because right now it's just kind of a homogeneous hodgepodge of inefficiencies. And it's creating our problem in California more so than the risk of fire. So those are just some thoughts on how holistically this can work better and make it, really reward communities that take the steps to prevent fire, flood, whatever it might be that, can be managed from a risk perspective. Thank you.
Jacqueline, I'm happy to add to that. I think Dan's spot on, and I think we look at it from two perspectives. One is to accurately price the risk, but also to be able to translate that risk reduction into value across the economy. So that's really where I think a lot of collaboration and really being able to demonstrate what risk reduction means, say in terms of borrowing capacity for a consumer and credit risk, and what that means to the bank, and what does that mean in terms of productivity to the economy, and actually being able to measure, articulate, and value that. So I think the accurate pricing of risk is just that number one most important signal, and we can't expect anybody in that whole ecosystem to act without that signal. So that absolutely step one. I think step two then is to be able to actually demonstrate and measure that value in whatever terminology and metric works for that stakeholder, whether it's investors being able to measure, compare, and have sort of an interoperable measure of the resilience of those investments, that they can then generate value out of that they can disclose it to markets. So I think the accurate pricing, the disclosure, and the value creation then brings every stakeholder across the economy and market to be able to start directing capital to resilience.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So a slightly different lens. So I think short-term mitigation is about rapid initial response for me. So detecting fire and putting it out as soon as you can. But that is a band-aid on a bigger problem that's been 100 years in the making. And if we're going to get to community scale resilience, over a generation, we need to return, as Antoine said, to healthy forests. And so that again brings us back to a collective action problem and a question of who pays. And I wonder, we've talked about this feedback loop between home hardening and insurability. Could you extend that and take it further so that a state knew, for example, that if they would be able to save their policyholders or their homeowners or their local businesses, billions of dollars of premium, or crowd in a lot more capital if they did the necessary work to thin and restore, ecosystem diversity to their forests. And at that high level, could we as a state or as a nation or as a globe for that matter, really extend the feedback loop out of the HOA and into a bigger picture?
Interesting. Antoine, any final thoughts from you on that topic?
Yes, maybe I need this one dimension of solution, which is to tackle the topic of how do you take decisions, financially speaking, in our big organizations. If I caricature a bit, when you want to invest today in our financial departments, when you have an investment, for example, of water treatment for your plant, you take the decision following prices of water. How does it cost me to use water? Is it profitable or not to invest in a recycling mechanism? If we do not go beyond this kind of over-optimized financial decision, we are nowhere in terms of adaptation. My wish is that we switch from this over-optimized financial decision to the idea of giving value to resilience, the elephant in the room. What is the value of being resilient? And this example of water recycling, if we model all the impact of water scarcity in one plant in terms of number of hours of business interruption, suddenly the investment is far more valuable than just based on prices of water. It's a very simple example just to say that we need to tackle the way we take decision, financially speaking, and we need to pursue the ultimate goal, which is for me to value the elephant in the room, which is what is the value of being resilient as a corporation, as a company. You cannot imagine the volume of hidden cost based on our very short-term and over-optimized day-to-day decision. My wish is we are able to be more aware in terms of financial decision based on this valuation of resilience. But still, Jacqueline, we are at the beginning of the journey.
Great, thank you. Antoine, I'm going to flip the very last question to you. So in addition to the pricing of risk, some of these financial things we've said, is there anything else that we can do to create an overall culture of prevention for consumers, businesses, government, communities?
It's for me still okay. You know well the weather of today, I guess. All stakeholders are on the table. In Paris, it's not a very good weather. It's very gray in the sky. I think the basic is really to be able to know the climate in 10 years' time. We have no excuse across our organizations not knowing it. We know it precisely thanks to scientists. So this kind of marketing gimmick that we can use in our day-to-day, just sharing this awareness, spreading this awareness around climate change, is to ask the question, what will be the climate in 10 years' time in your plant, in your house? And to be sure that, yes, these figures, this risk is known, and it will be a good starting point.
Thank you. I know we see that in the US, at least, in some of the home sale websites where you can now see whether you're in a flood zone or if you're in a fire zone, et cetera. So you can get an idea of what might be coming your way in the future, which I know for many people has impacted their choices. Anybody have any last thoughts on our topic before we flip over to Miriam for Q&A? All right. Miriam.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and our great panelist. So many questions has popped up, but I want to start with that last thought that came about through Antoine, and that is the idea of being able to look forward to how, not only extreme event and slow changing climatic trends are changing, but in terms of our socioeconomic behaviors and choices we are making, how exposure and vulnerabilities are changing along the full life cycle of the assets that we are talking about. And I think that is where technology has started to play a big role. We are starting to do this forward-looking stochastic modeling built on deep science and also AI. Now, it seems like we have given a wrong impression to some of our participants, saying it appears that no one is engaged in concrete, innovative, disruptive activities. And I think what we try to do here is just the opposite. that there are a number of concrete, innovative, disruptive activities by various stakeholders in various regions. And by the way, a lot of them are outlined in our report, Safeguarding Home Insurance. So let me come back to all of you, and anybody wants to raise hand for quickly. Where do you see concrete disruptive activities that's starting to change resilience at the local level at scale? Kate, I know you've invested 15 years, 20 years of your life on this. Can you start with that? I will go to Dan and then Mike and Antoine. Please just share one or two without details, but just the fact that do you believe they are disruptive activities by different stakeholders to start shifting this issue?
I think there are, and if we consider, how much suffering is going on, around our communities, and it's only getting worse. And while that's, a hopeless situation, it can feel like to people, what's really fascinating is seeing the innovation and I guess the empowerment and the motivation to do something. And while there's innovation coming out of technology companies and, new ways of, I guess, being able to identify where risk is and looking for all those efficiencies and more effective ways that we can combat these risks and adapt. What is really exciting to us is seeing a lot of that coming from unexpected places. So we're getting, the local builder coming up with this new way of, protecting the edges of roofs from ember entry, or, all these micro things happening on the ground that are actually, and we're able to measure that, seeing how much action is actually being taken. That is some collective action that's going on. And I think what we'd really like to see, and I'm sure the rest of the panel would agree, is far more support and risk-taking to support the innovators, whether that's startups or, community-level action. It really needs a boost. The ideas are there. The scale, I think, is what we could build on. But I feel really hopeful and inspired when I see those actual really small physical things happening house by house, community by community. And back to Dan's point, it's not just those individual homes, but the community groups that are springing up and leading their own sort of resilience networks. And, that's getting really interesting, and they're thinking much more in a collective way. What can we do to create the green fire breaks? Or, what can we do to support this local tech company that's coming up with some great ideas? But it needs more support.
Yeah. Dan, I want to come to you. What would it take to take the wildfire prepared community that you are building with the builders community in California and expand it along United States and beyond? What is standing by way of scaling these solutions?
Well, actually, not much. The exciting part about the wildfire resilience versus, climate resilience or energy efficiency, when we build to the highest standards, the cost associated with that is de minimis. So, in Class A roofs don't cost any different now than Class B. They did 15 years ago. They don't today. Having closed eaves costs you nothing. Dual pane tempered windows cost you a little bit more in siding, and then fencing that's not made of wood, maybe $6,000 to $8,000. But our average home price is $900,000 for the average home, and so adding $8,000 to that, it's not a big deal. So to your question, it's really just educating the rest of the building community. We've been forced to do this out of cost and insurance mechanism, but we as an industry have a reputation and somewhat earned that we resist code changes, and we want to build the houses we want to build. We have learned in this process to work with the insurance industry, and as I mentioned before, with IBHS, and say, hey, what are the best standards and how much more does it cost? And IBHS has put out a report on this. It's pretty close to our numbers too. To build fire safe homes really costs very little more. So let's do it, countrywide. I think it's education, information. And again, I'll go back to the insurance mechanism. I worked for Zurich and Farmers for a number of years, so I appreciate how it works. But if you reward people's good behavior and say, hey, if you build these standards, you build an entire community standards, we will put in community rating and we will put in individual home rating. That itself it will pay for itself in a year. The difference between the premium of a fire-safe home and a non-fire safe community is many times fivefold. So you're talking about paying for this in 18 months. So a lot of it's just education. It's partnering with the industry and its science groups like IBHS, and then it's, and educating nationwide how these positive steps are really not expensive and are profoundly important to managing risk more effectively.
And just on that point, I think certification programs that we have seen, for example, for green building, which are supported by government, leads to better valuation. If we can replicate that for resilient buildings and create the incentives on higher prices, lower insurance, potentially lower mortgage, this is where people see that immediately the value is generated as opposed to us waiting for the next 40, 50 years. Thank you for that, Mike.
Exactly.
To you. You talk about innovation and the three phases. Just to the question that our audience has asked, can you tell us 2 or 3 innovations that you already see are transforming wildfire management, and what stands by way of scaling and adoption of this kind of transformative innovation?
Only 2 or 3, huh? I mean,
they're great. We don't have time. Otherwise, I would say list
sure.
them.
Just to allay the fears that there's nothing bubbling, I think we track over 2,000 fire tech companies. We have 22 in our portfolio. We see dozens every week. I would say it's a couple that are really maturing and scaling fast. One, there's a company called Overstory that works with utilities to do effective vegetation management. They have a competitor that's also great called AI Dash. Utilities used to sample a selection of their transmission want lines with people or helicopters. They'd do 5% a year, and they'd, kind of extrapolate that. Using software and sensors in field, and variety of sensors in field, they can now do the entire transmission network all the time, real time, to really figure out where they need to do brush work, where they need to trim trees, so that they can really decrease the risk of wildfire there. And that's, these are both AI Dash and Overstory are growing very, very quickly with a very motivated buyer. Another I'd call out is just, we've talked a bit about cameras. There's a company called Pano that is, I think, one of many great companies in the camera world, but they've put a really awesome HD sensor out in the field. But what they've done that others haven't is they've integrated the feed straight through to first responders, so that fire departments and whoever else is, getting will get real-time alerts, can see a view into the field and really prioritize where they're going. And I think that they're rolling out very, very quickly. In terms of barriers to adoption, I think where you have a really motivated single buyer, we're seeing really clear acceleration. It's trickier where you don't, right? And so, utilities are really motivated. PG&E went bankrupt over the Camp Fire, right? They spend billions of dollars a year in wildfire mitigation. That's a great place to start, right? But where you step away from a single motivated buyer, that's where I think we need to do work in collective action.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anton, coming to you. Speaking of these collective action, you talked about ways that we can trigger systemic change in talking wildfires. Where can insurance industry motivate that? That's the first question. And then the second question that has come up, how can insurers, through their investments, big investors in infrastructure and industrial assets, sort of put conditions for resilience to the developers of those systems? Can there be a role to be played by insurers?
Oh, difficult questions. I just want to build on your comment about the fact that there are, in fact, hopefully for us, many very disruptive and useful solutions locally. The problem that we face is the solution will not come from us, the executive around the table. We need to look at these local solutions and to take them into consideration. And that's a big change and change of paradigm. If I take my example, I was really comfortable in my office in Paris. I decided 2 years ago to spend half of my week on the field just to meet people doing stuff. And it was a very shocking moment because I understood that solution were there. The problem was coming from the fact that we were not at the service of these guys. So it's the inverse time. So this local solution needs capital and consideration. I will share you one anecdote. I will not be too long. I had discussion with underwriters for property telling me we cannot insure anymore this specific place of France because of flood. But they told me, I have been told about one local guy camping, having done this kind of innovative and disruptive solution against flood. So his camping, his property is protected. I asked them, so you took the decision to insure them? And he told me no, because it's local. And I think the big danger is this kind of answer, no, because it's local. And that's where technology can help. If we are able to bring this kind of tailor-made local solution in our standardized global decision of underwriting and investment, we get the two of the best worlds. And data and technology will help us for that. But be sure that you have local solution, and as an insurer, we need to be able to take into consideration local solutions. We are used to as financial institutions, standardization, because it's a way to make it global, to put at scale, etc. But for adaptation, it doesn't work.
Oh.
So if we do not integrate local solutions in our processes, global processes, we will fail. So for me, the key element is technology and being able to integrate local knowledge in our decision.
Thank you so much. Now, this is to all of you, with one way or another, if you have. Reality is, it's really great to sit here and talk about who needs to do, but reality that there are families that for decades have lived in very high risk zone, and the risk have gone up, not only because of what has happened to their home, but what has happened around them, with land zoning, with destruction of nature-based system, with dysfunctional utilities, to the point that you raised, Mike, with aging infrastructure. Now we're demanding that these folks move out and move to another area as one of the solutions, particularly when the risks are getting high. Are there examples of successful stories that have done that and have justified with the population that this is the best decision to make for their families and over long terms? Anything that you can share? Any reactions from any of you to that?
Yeah, we've had quite a few buyback programs in Australia. They're very expensive, and we've got about 15% of households that can't afford insurance, so really high risk and highly financially vulnerable as well. So that's about $1 trillion worth of property. So we can't buy all that back, but what we can do, I think, is really target those types of strategic retreat programs, but people need to be brought into that journey over a long period of time. So the buybacks that we've had here have sort of been some successes and some failures, and I think people are much more interested in the land swaps and really looking at that as a whole community approach. At the moment, it looks like some of the streets where we've had buybacks in particularly high flood risk areas, there's a house, then no house, and then businesses disappearing, and it really is a bit of a mishmash. But we've found that communities are much more open to having those conversations if they're brought along the journey, and that there's some sensible alternatives that isn't just about leaving them isolated and without a pathway, but a very expensive proposition. But there's certainly areas where flooding's going over the top of roofs that is forcing those discussions.
Thank you very much. Dan, any comments, any experiences in California?
Not really. We're too libertarian to allow for that, and we fight that. I mean, we'll rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. The only place I've seen is more in flood, where you just no longer can get flood insurance if you've had multiple floods. And it's not so much a buyback, it's just an insurance mechanism that forces you to move. But I mean, all of the major fire areas, burn areas we've had in California have been rebuilt in part. I say in part because a lot of people lose insurance proceeds or additional living expense or whatever, and they just sell their lot and move on. But eventually, so far, we've rebuilt those communities. So buyback is something that we haven't really fathomed, and everything we do in California is stunningly expensive, to Kate's point. So affordable housing costs $1 million a unit in California. So it gives you an example. It's kind of we have a lot of ironic terms in California when it comes to government. And so the buyback probably would cost us For $1 million home, it probably costs us $5 million, so it just doesn't work cost effectively either. So that's so far not so good.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Clearly, this is a conversation to continue and much to do on the ground. And I think what we tried to show is the movement has started, but scaling and investing in it is going to need a lot more. And this a lot more is coming from every direction. So I want to thank you, first of all, Jacqueline, for the great moderation and the panelists for great discussion. This is just the beginning. I will be in touch with all of you as we embark on our future work. But I want to close this panel and with no delays, move to my dear colleague, Jad Aris, Managing Director of Geneva Association, to say a few closing remarks. Jad, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and thank you to all our panelists for sharing their insights. As we come to the close of this conference, I wish to reflect on what has resonated most throughout today's discussions. Across Andreas Berger's speech, across both panels, a thread ran quite clearly. Resilience is not just about surviving the next disaster. It's about shaping a future where prevention, stakeholder alignment, and innovation are factored into everything we do. And let me say a few words about these three words: prevention, alignment, innovation. Prevention first. There's an urgent need to move from reacting to disasters to preventing them. We've emphasized a lot today. The world cannot continue to spend trillions responding to disasters that we could have prevented. Prevention must become the default, a foundational principle for how we plan housing, how we plan infrastructure, how we plan energy systems. It means embedding resilience into every stage, from permitting and procurement to construction and financing. It means also designing communities that are strong by design, not just brave in recovery, as they too often are. And it means seeing prevention not as a cost, but as a value proposition. Here, the insurance industry has a critical role to play by incentivizing prevention. We've talked a lot about this today, by helping communities and businesses understand and manage their risk exposure, and by using risk-based pricing. So many of our speakers today emphasized the importance of risk-based pricing. Number two, stakeholder alignment. Building resilience at scale requires an ecosystem of stakeholders that work together across sectors, across silos, across boundaries, across geographies. No single company, no single community, no single government can do this alone. We need, for example, public policy that prioritizes prevention, regulation that rewards risk reduction, investment frameworks that support resilience. And we need households and businesses that are informed and empowered to make different decisions, to adapt their behaviors, and to make the investments needed. Insurance, again, sits at the center of this ecosystem, translating risk knowledge into economic signals that guide smarter planning and investment, and consciously evolving from a payer of losses into a strategic partner in prevention. Third, innovation. Innovation is our multiplier. From satellite-based risk mapping to AI-driven wildfire detection, we just talked about wildfires, from resilient building materials to community preparedness programs, technology is giving us new ways to adapt and to act. Innovation isn't about just technology, it's about mindsets, partnerships that share data openly, communities that feel empowered to lead in local solutions. The insurance industry is at the forefront of this innovation, investing in data-driven tools, partnering with technology firms, creating new offerings that reward risk reduction. These advances transform information into foresight, and they transform insurance from a safety net into an enabler of resilience. So as we conclude, let's carry forward these three imperatives: building prevention into everything we do, align stakeholders for collective resilience, and unleash innovation, not just in our tools, but also in our mindsets. If today's discussions have shown us anything, it's that resilience is no longer about bouncing back. We used to say it's about bouncing back. It's really about building forward. Thank you again to all our speakers and to each of you for joining us today. Mariam, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jad, and thank you to all of you. As we hang up, a pop-up survey will be presented to you. Please fill it in. We would appreciate this feedback to continue improving our online events. And I want to thank the speakers, all of you for joining us today. And I'm deeply grateful to our conference unit and my dear colleague, Natalie Saber, for making this possible. We hope you enjoyed the conference. Be happy and stay safe. Thank you very much. Have a great day and evening. Bye-bye.